I hadn't touched that fence in 2 years. She fixed it before breakfast. She'd come with a wagon and $40 and a question I didn't have. The ranch was dying. I was letting it. Then she asked, "Can I try?" And that was the word that changed everything on this broken land. I hadn't touched that fence in 2 years. She fixed it before breakfast. I stood there in the gray light with a tin cup going cold in my hand, the coffee bitter and the morning sharp. And I looked at that fence line running along the south pasture, and I could not make sense of it. The wire was taut. The posts were straight. Somebody had driven 3 new cedar posts where the old ones had rotted through, and they'd done it quiet enough that I hadn't heard a thing from the porch where I'd been sitting since 4 in the morning, staring at nothing. I'm an old man now. My hands shake when I pour. The brass wedding band on my left ring finger has worn so thin you can almost see through it. And my shoulders carry a permanent stoop, like the years are sitting on them physically. But I remember that morning. I remember the way the light hit the Absaroka Range and turned the snow on the peaks the color of a peach. And I remember looking down at that fence and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something close to confusion. Something close to being woken up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back. 20 years before that morning, I rode into this valley with a woman named Josephine and $14 in my coat pocket. We had a deed to 300 acres of rocky foothill country that nobody else wanted because the soil was thin and the wind came down the canyon like it had a personal grudge. Josephine looked at it and said, "Well, it's ours." That was enough for her. That was always enough for her. We built the house first, then the barn, then 50 acres of fenced pasture, section by section, me digging post holes until my palms bled through the leather gloves, and Josephine stringing wire behind me with her jaw set and her hair tied back and not one word of complaint. We survived that first winter on salt pork and creek water and the kind of stubbornness that looks like insanity from the outside, but feels like the only sane thing when you're in it. By spring, we had 12 head of cattle. By the second year, 40. We were building something. Every board we nailed, every fence we strung, every calf we pulled at 3 in the morning, it was all one long sentence, and we were writing it together. Then pneumonia wrote the period. 2 winters before that morning at the fence, Josephine got sick on a Tuesday and was gone by Sunday. 5 days. That's all it took to erase 20 years of building. 5 days, and the silence moved in like it had been waiting outside the door the whole time. Patient, knowing it would get its turn. I kept rising before dawn because I didn't know any other motion. But the motions didn't mean anything anymore. The fence lines sagged. The barn roof started leaking in the northwest corner, and I watched the water stain spread across the boards like a bruise. And I did nothing. I sold cattle when I needed money for flour and coffee and tobacco. Went from 40 head down to 30. The ranch was dying the way I was dying. Slow, mechanical. One thing at a time letting go. Across the creek, Hector Garza watched all of this and said nothing. Hector had worked the neighboring parcel for 15 years. Stocky, barrel-chested, steel-gray hair combed straight back from a high forehead. That worn, leather-handled hatchet always hanging from a loop on his belt, like it was part of his body. Deep brown eyes that watched everything and judged nothing. He'd see me on the road and nod. That was it, a nod. But his wife Dolores, short, sharp-eyed, silver-streaked hair pinned up tight, hands perpetually on her hips, Dolores had opinions. I'd hear later that she'd said things at her own supper table. Things like, "That man is burying himself next to her and calling it loyalty." Things like, Somebody needs to say something before Parnell gets his hands on that water. Parnell. Let me tell you about Parnell. Tall, narrow-built, sandy blonde hair slicked back with pomade, pale green eyes set too close together in a face that had never once been hit by wind or sun or honest work. He wore a black wool frock coat and a gray silk cravat and polished black leather shoes that had no business being anywhere near actual dirt. A gold pocket watch chain looped from his vest pocket, always visible, always catching the light like he wanted you to see it. Like he wanted you to know exactly what time it was and how little of yours he intended to waste. He was a land speculator out of Helena, and he wanted my water rights. The creek that ran through my property fed into the Yellowstone drainage, and Parnell had been buying up parcels along that corridor for 2 years, assembling them like a man building a wall. My 300 acres were the gap in his fence. He came to the house in September, stood on my porch with his chin jutted forward and his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at the sagging barn and the weed-choked yard and said, "Mr. Cade, I admire a man who knows when he's finished." I admire a man who knows when he's finished, like he was doing me a favor, like the dying was something I should be grateful he'd noticed. He offered $15 a month in lease payments if I'd sign over the water rights, or a lump sale at a price so low it was an insult wearing a smile. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "Don't think too long. Places like this don't get better with time." Then he looked at Josephine's garden, the dead stalks of what had been tomatoes and sage and marigolds, and he smiled. That thin, clean, bloodless smile. "Shame about the garden," he said. "I almost signed those papers. I want you to understand that." The ranch was already gone in my mind. I was a man earning $15 a month from his own failure, and that felt about right. Then the wagon appeared on the road to Elk Fork. It was early October. The aspens had gone gold, and the air had that clean, cold bite that tells you winter is done being polite. I was at the water trough, filling it from the hand pump, when I saw the wagon coming up the valley road. A woman driving. Beside her on the bench sat a young woman with light auburn hair tangled from wind and a small leather-bound book open on her knees. Clara Dunhill stepped down from that wagon like she was stepping onto her own land. Fair skin, wind roughened across the cheeks. Dark auburn braid hanging to her mid-back with loose strands escaping at the temples. Warm brown eyes taking inventory of everything in front of her. She wore a faded dark blue work dress over a cream undershirt, a brown leather belt cinched at the waist, and boots that had walked through worse than my yard. A thin silver chain hung at her neck with a small plain ring threaded on it. Her hands were calloused. Her back was straight. Her husband, John Dunhill, had ridden out for supplies 18 months ago and never came back. She held their place in the Bitterroot alone for a full year. The bank took it anyway. She had $40 in her pocket and a daughter named Bess, and everything she owned was in that wagon. She looked at my water trough. She looked at the barn, leaning but not fallen. She looked at the creek running clear over smooth stones. She looked at the mountains. "This the Cade property?" I told her it was. I told her it wasn't worth the listing price. I told her the truth. The ranch is too broken to save. Clara looked at the leaning barn, the clear creek, the mountains turning gold in the October light. She touched that silver chain at her neck. "Can I try?" The deal was simple. Tenant through winter, fair price in spring, or she leaves and Parnell gets it. I agreed. Not because I believed in her, because her failure would prove what I already knew. Clara and Bess moved into the old bunkhouse the next morning. Clara started on the fences before the sun cleared the ridge. I know because I watched. Not up close. From the porch mostly. Coffee in hand, coat buttoned against the October chill. Pale gray-blue eyes squinting across 200 yards of pasture, while a woman I barely knew drove fence posts into ground that hadn't been worked in 14 months. She started with the south line. Smart choice. That's where the creek runoff eats the soil every spring, where the posts rot fastest. She'd brought her own tools, which surprised me. A post maul that looked like it weighed nearly as much as she did. A hand saw with a warped handle. Wire cutters that needed oiling. She worked from first light until the mountains ate the sun, and she did not stop for anything I could see except water. First 3 days I counted. She reset 9 posts, pulled and replaced 41 shingles on the barn roof, climbing up there with a hammer tucked in her belt and her dark auburn braids swinging against her back while the wind tried to peel her off. Dug out 18 feet of the irrigation ditch that had silted over since I'd stopped caring about irrigation ditches. And the ditch gate. That damn ditch gate. Here's the thing about that gate. It's a plank and lever system Josephine figured out in our second year on the land. You can't just lift it. The hinge pin is set at an angle, about 15 degrees off true, because the gate frame settled into the mud that first winter and we never fixed it square. You have to pull left and lift at the same time, or you'll strip the pin and the whole thing binds up. Josephine figured that out in about 10 minutes. Took me 2 days of cursing to learn it from her. Clara couldn't get it open. I watched her fight it for an hour on the second day. She tried brute force. She tried finesse. She tried kicking it, which I respected. She walked away, came back, tried again. Got it partially open, which is worse than closed because now the water trickles instead of flows and the south pasture turns to soup instead of draining clean. Third morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked over. Didn't say much. Just put my hands on the gate, pulled left, lifted, and it swung free. Water ran clean and fast into the ditch, the way it was supposed to. Clara stood there with her calloused hands on her hips, that brown leather belt cinched tight at her waist. Loose strands of auburn hair stuck to her temples with sweat. She looked at the gate. She looked at me. "Show me," she said. So I showed her. Took about 3 minutes. She did it herself twice to make sure she had it. Then I walked over to the south fence line where she'd been working and saw that 2 of the posts she'd set were angled wrong. Not badly, but enough that the wire would sag by spring. I reset them. Didn't ask, just did it. Next morning I was there again. No discussion. She was already digging out the ditch extension toward the east pasture, and I started on the fence line where she'd left off. We worked 30 feet apart for 6 hours and spoke maybe a dozen words. She handed me the wire cutters once. I held a post steady while she tamped the base. That was it. That was the whole courtship, though neither of us would have called it anything at all. Bess was different. Bess talked. She'd lean against the fence post with that small leather-bound book in her hand, hazel green eyes watching everything, and she'd ask questions like she was cataloging the world. What were the mountains called? How cold did it get in January? Whether the horses knew their names or just the sound of grain in a bucket. And then, on the 4th day, she asked about the cottonwood tree. "Who's buried there?" She said it plain, no tiptoeing. 18 years old with her mother's pointed chin and a directness that caught me sideways. I looked at the tree, the little iron fence I'd put around the grave, the wooden marker I'd carved and sealed with pine tar so the letters wouldn't fade. My wife, I said. Josephine. How long ago? 2 years come February. Bess nodded. She wrote something in her book. I don't know what. She didn't ask how Josephine died, and I was grateful for that, because I would have told her. That was the surprise, the honesty rising up in me like water through cracked rock. I'd spent 2 years not talking to anyone about anything that mattered, and this girl, with the tangled light auburn hair and the too big cardigan, asked me a straight question, and I gave her a straight answer, and the sky didn't fall. She saw things, Bess did, things the adults wouldn't name for months. Dolores Garza showed up on the 5th day with a cast-iron pot of pozole and a look on her face that could have stripped paint. She stood in the bunkhouse doorway, short, sturdy, dark brown eyes moving fast, and watched Clara eat. Watched how Clara held the spoon. Watched how Clara's hands shook slightly from exhaustion, but her back stayed straight, chin lifted, not one word of complaint. Dolores set the pot on the table. "Tomorrow I bring bread," she said. That was approval. From Dolores, that was a standing ovation. Hector started leaving tools on the fence posts. A good post maul with a proper handle. A set of wire cutters that actually cut. A sharpened handsaw. He never said anything about it, just left them and walked away. That worn, leather-handled hatchet swinging from his belt loop, arms folded, feet planted wide, like a man who'd decided something and saw no reason to discuss it. Sunday supper at the Garza table. 4 plates instead of 2. Dolores's dark green wool dress and cream apron, Hector's dark red flannel, Clara's faded blue work dress, and me in my charcoal coat pretending this was normal. Pretending I hadn't eaten alone for 2 years. Bess sat on the porch step with her book and a plate balanced on her knees, and Dolores brought her seconds without being asked. November came in cold and sharp. The fences tightened. The barn stopped leaking. Clara rode south to Elk Fork and came back with a deal that made me set down my coffee and stare. 12 head of cattle. $8 a head when the going rate was 11. $96 total for stock that was worth $132. She'd negotiated the rancher down by offering to drive them herself, which she did over 2 days, with Bess riding drag on a borrowed mare. The south pasture drained properly. I noticed because I'd walked out there to check, which was a thing I hadn't done in over a year. The bunkhouse chimney drew well. I could tell from the clean, thin smoke rising straight in the still air. No backdraft, no billowing. And that's when I felt it. The dangerous thing. The thing I'd sworn I was done with after I put Josephine in the ground under that cottonwood tree, and the dull brass wedding band stayed on my finger, like a promise to never promise anything again. I cared whether the south pasture drained properly. I cared whether Clara's chimney drew well. I cared whether 12 head of cattle at $8 each would be enough to get her through winter. Caring. That was the thing I swore I was finished with. And there it was, settling into me quiet as frost, and twice as hard to stop. December arrived with Parnell. I heard the buggy before I saw it. A black-topped rig pulled by a matched pair of bays, moving up the ranch road like it had been invited. Nobody had invited it. The man who stepped down wore a black wool frock coat over a white starched shirt, a gray silk cravat knotted tight at his throat, and a gold pocket watch chain looping from his vest pocket like he wanted you to see it. Pale green eyes, close set, scanning the property the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. Sandy blonde hair slicked back with pomade, going gray, parted dead center. Thin wrists, long fingers. the kind of hands that had never held a post-hole digger or pulled a calf. His name was Parnell. He had a leather case under his arm and a number on his lips, and both of them were too high. He sat at Josephine's kitchen table like he owned it already. Spread his papers out across the pine surface where I'd eaten 6 months of quiet suppers. The offer was $1,200. The ranch wasn't worth $1,200. Not the buildings, not the stock, not the hay in the barn. I knew that. He knew I knew that. "Mr. Cade," he said, leaning forward with his chin jutted out, one pointed finger tapping the deed. "You're a man of no fixed situation. No wife, no heirs present, no operation to speak of. This land is doing nothing for you, and frankly, you're doing nothing for it." That word, frankly, like honesty, was a favor he was doing me. He wanted the water rights. He said it plain enough: a mining consortium upstream, placer operations expanding south, needed guaranteed flow. The creek that ran through the north pasture and fed the south meadow and kept 60 acres of grass alive through July. That water. He dressed it up in legal language about easements and riparian access, but the bones of it were simple. He wanted to buy the ranch so he could kill the creek. He slid the pen across the table. I picked it up, and then I looked out the kitchen window. Clara was splitting wood in the cold. Her dark auburn braid hung down her back, loose strands escaping at the temples the way they always did. The brown leather belt was cinched tight at her waist, the gray wool shawl thrown over the fence post beside her because it got in the way of the axe. She swung steady and true, each log split clean. She didn't look toward the house. She didn't know what was happening inside it, or if she did, she gave no sign. Beyond her, on the bunkhouse step, Bess sat wrapped in a horse blanket with that small leather-bound book open on her knees. 18 years old, light auburn hair tangled from wind, hazel green eyes moving across the page. The half-smile she always wore. She turned a page and pulled the blanket tighter. I held the pen. The brass wedding band on my left ring finger caught the gray winter light. I could feel the weight of the moment like a physical thing, like the air in the kitchen had thickened, like the walls were leaning in. I set the pen down. "I need more time," I said. Parnell's pale green eyes went flat. His thin lips pressed together. He gathered his papers with those long, soft fingers, sliding them into the leather case with a precision that was meant to communicate something. Displeasure. Patience running thin. "Time," he repeated. "Mr. Cade, men like you don't accumulate time. You spend it, and you spend it poorly." He stood, buttoning his frock coat. "I'll return in the new year. The number won't be the same." He said it like a threat, because it was one. I watched his buggy roll back down the ranch road, and I sat there at the table for a long time after it disappeared. The papers were gone, but I could still see them. The pen was still where I'd set it. And the thing that turned in my chest wasn't relief. It was recognition. Here's what I understood. Sitting alone in that kitchen, with the wood stove ticking and Clara's axe still ringing outside. Parnell didn't want the ranch. He wanted the water. And the water was the only reason the ranch worked. Every blade of grass in the south pasture, every head of cattle that grazed it, every fence post Clara had helped me set, every irrigation ditch Hector had cut with his worn leather-handled hatchet. All of it depended on that creek running clean and full through the property. Selling wasn't letting go. Selling was destroying the thing Josephine built. It was pulling the heart out of 60 acres and handing the corpse to a man who'd strip mine the watershed and leave the valley dry as bone. A small noise. That's what it would have been. A pen touching paper. My name in ink. And from that small noise, catastrophic failure. Every acre downstream dead. Every neighbor's well gone shallow. Every living thing that drank from that water left with dust. I almost did it. That's the part I can't get past. I almost signed because it was easier than staying. That night I walked to Josephine's grave. The snow was ankle deep and still falling, soft and steady, the kind of snow that erases everything. I sat on the cold ground beside the stone and I didn't say anything, because I'd stopped talking to her months ago. I just sat there with my hands in the pockets of my charcoal wool coat and my breath making clouds in the dark. Clara found me there. I don't know how long I'd been sitting. She came through the snow in her black lace-up boots, the gray shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, and she sat down beside me without a word. The thin silver chain at her throat caught the moonlight, her mother's wedding band threaded on it, resting against her collarbone. We sat in silence for a long time. The snow fell on both of us. The creek made its quiet sound in the dark. I almost sold the ranch, I said. I know, she said. I looked at her. Her warm brown eyes were steady. The 3 freckles on her left cheekbone, the crescent birthmark on the right side of her neck. She'd known. She'd watched Parnell arrive, and she'd watched him leave, and she'd said nothing. Why didn't you say anything? She was quiet for a moment. Her breath hung in the cold air between us. Because it's yours to decide. I'm not going to beg a man to let me stay somewhere. I did that once already. The first time she mentioned John, her husband, the man who'd left her with a ranch she couldn't run and a pride she couldn't set down. She said it without bitterness, just fact. The way you'd say, the creek runs south, or the winter comes in December. And I understood. Sitting there in the snow beside Josephine's grave, I understood it perfectly. Clara was afraid to need a place that could be taken from her. I was afraid to need a person who could leave. The same fear, wearing different clothes. 2 people sitting 3 inches apart in the snow, both terrified of the exact same thing, neither one able to say it plain. Across the creek, a lamp burned in the Garza kitchen. Dolores stood at her window, compact, alert, dark brown eyes sharp and quick-moving, watching 2 figures sitting together in the snow beside a headstone. She'd seen us walking together, working together, sitting in silence together. The dark green wool of her dress was just visible in the lamplight, her hands resting on her hips the way they always did. She said nothing. She turned from the window and let us be. But she knew. And I think, somehow, sitting there in the falling snow with Clara's shoulder almost touching mine, I was starting to know it too. Clara said, "Because it's yours to decide. I'm not going to beg a man to let me stay somewhere. I did that once already." And Elias understood that her fear mirrored his own perfectly. January came like it had something to prove. 3 days of wind that turned the world white and took 4 cattle with it. I'd seen bad winters, spent one in a line shack outside Billings, with the snow piled to the roof, and I burned chair legs for heat. But this was different. This was personal. The kind of storm that finds the weak spot in everything you've built and drives a fist through it. Temperature dropped to 14 below on the first night. By the second morning it was 20 below, and the wind was running at 40 miles an hour across the open ground between the house and the barn. You couldn't see your hand. You couldn't hear your own voice. The world was just white noise and cold so deep it got into your teeth. The section of barn we'd repaired in November, the section I'd spent 9 days on, the section Clara and I had re-roofed together while Bess handed up nails, collapsed at 4 in the afternoon on the second day. The crossbeam split clean down the middle, sounded like a rifle shot, and then the whole east wall folded inward like a man going to his knees. 4 cattle dead by the time we found them, 2 from the cold, 2 crushed under the fallen timber. That's $800 of livestock gone in a single afternoon. On a ranch running margins thinner than creek ice in March, that's not a setback. That's a wound. Clara didn't cry, didn't curse. She looked at the dead animals and said, "We need to get the rest into the west side before dark." So that's what we did. 36 hours. That's how long we worked without stopping. 36 hours of hauling cattle through snow that came to my thighs, pulling on frozen ropes that burned through my gloves and left the skin on my palms cracked and bleeding. The cattle didn't want to move. They never do when they're scared. A 1,200-pound heifer that's decided she'd rather freeze where she stands than walk 50 yards to shelter. You can't reason with that. You lean into her flank, and you push, and you talk low and steady, and you hope she decides to trust you before your legs give out. Clara worked the lantern, held it high so I could see the path through the drifts. The light caught the snow sideways and turned everything gold, and then black, and then gold again. Her dark auburn braid was stiff with ice. The loose strands at her temples had frozen into small curls against her skin. She didn't complain, not once. Not about the cold, not about her hands, not about the fact that the ranch she'd held together alone for 3 years was coming apart around her in real time. Bess kept the fire going in the main house, stoked it every hour, kept water hot, had blankets ready. At some point during the first night, I don't remember exactly when, I'd moved my things from the bunkhouse to the room off the kitchen. The bunkhouse was too cold. The stove in there couldn't keep up with the wind coming through the walls. The main house had room. Nobody said what it meant. Clara didn't invite me. I didn't ask. I just carried my bedroll and my saddlebag through the snow and set them in the corner of that room, and Bess put a folded quilt on the floor without a word. That was it. The significance hung in the air like wood smoke, and none of us looked directly at it. 3 a.m, second night. We'd gotten the last of the surviving cattle into the west side of the barn and blocked the gaps with hay bales and whatever timber hadn't split. My hands were past numb. They'd gone through the burning stage and into that dead white stillness that means you're in trouble. Clara's hands gave out first. She was trying to tie off a rope on the gate latch, and her fingers just stopped working. I watched her try 3 times. Watched her jaw tighten each time. Watched the frustration move across her face like weather across a ridge, fast and honest and impossible to hide. She didn't ask for help. Of course she didn't. I reached over and took her hands, both of them, pulled them between my own and held them there. Her fingers were ice, small and rough and ice cold against my palms, and I pressed them together and breathed on them and held them until the color started coming back. Neither of us spoke. The lantern was on the ground between us, throwing light up into her face. I could see the 3 freckles on her left cheekbone, just below her eye. Could see the fine lines at the corners of her warm brown eyes. Could see the crescent-shaped birthmark on the right side of her neck below her jaw, half hidden by the collar of her coat. She looked at me. I looked at her hands. The feeling started returning to her fingers. I could tell because she flexed them slightly against my palms. A small movement, deliberate, not pulling away. Neither of us let go when we should have. That was the moment. After all those months of proximity without touching, after the fences and the cattle and the roof and the creek crossings and the suppers eaten 3 feet apart at a table built for 2. After all that careful distance, her frozen hands between mine in a barn at 3 in the morning while the wind tried to tear the world apart outside. I held on. She let me. Dawn came slow. The wind died first, then the snow thinned, and then the sky cracked open along the eastern ridge like someone had drawn a line of pale gold across the bottom of everything. We walked out of the barn together, not touching, but close. Close in the way you walk beside someone when you've stopped keeping track of the space between you. The ranch looked like a battlefield, snow piled against every wall, the collapsed section of barns sagging under white weight, fence posts leaning at broken angles across the north pasture. But the house was standing. Smoke was coming from the chimney. The west barn was holding. Hector and Dolores came up the road an hour later, their wagon cutting fresh tracks through the drifts. Hector's steel-gray hair was tucked under a wool cap, and his tan canvas jacket was buttoned to the throat. Dolores sat beside him, wrapped in her black knitted shawl, dark brown eyes already taking inventory of every damaged thing on the property before the wagon even stopped. But she wasn't looking at the barn. She was looking at us. At me and Clara, standing 6 inches apart by the water trough, breath visible in the cold morning air. Dolores looked at Hector. The single deep dimple on his left cheek appeared as he started to speak, but she cut him off. "Finally," she said. Hector shook his head slowly. "Don't interfere." Dolores climbed down from the wagon, her strong hands already reaching for the work ahead, and she said it without looking back. The way you say something you've known for months. I never interfere. I just make sure there's enough food for 4 at Sunday supper. February. Parnell came back with a lawyer and a piece of paper he thought was a weapon. A lien. From a debt Elias took on during Josephine's illness. $312 owed to a creditor in Helena, signed in Elias's own hand, dated 18 months before she died. The kind of debt a man takes on when his wife is coughing blood, and the doctor in town says there's a specialist in Butte who might help. The kind of debt a man forgets about when the specialist doesn't help, and the wife dies anyway, and the world goes gray and stays that way. Parnell rode up the lane in a hired carriage. A hired carriage. In February. In Montana. The man had a lawyer beside him, some thin-necked clerk from Helena, with ink-stained fingers and a leather case. And Parnell himself sat there in that black wool frock coat, gold watch chain catching the winter light. Chin jutted forward like always, pale green eyes already counting the acres. He didn't knock. He stood in the yard and called out like a man summoning a dog. "Cade, I've got business." Elias came out in his charcoal wool coat, cream Henley underneath, the dull brass wedding band catching on the door frame the way it always did. He looked at Parnell. He looked at the lawyer. He looked at the paper. "You owe $312, Parnell said, plus interest. That's $409 now. You don't have it. You can't get it. This lien gives me the right to force a sale." He smiled. That soft, pink, clean-shaven smile. "I told you this place was too much for you, Cade. Should have taken my offer when I gave it. Would have saved you the embarrassment." The lawyer opened his leather case and held out the document like it was a death certificate. Elias took it, read it. His hands didn't shake. "I'll need a week," he said. Parnell laughed. actually laughed. A week to do what? Find $400 under a rock? You're done, Cade. You've been done. Everyone in this valley knows it except you. A week, Elias said again. And Parnell, because he was the kind of man who enjoyed watching someone struggle before the end, said fine. 1 week. Here's the thing about Parnell. He never once considered that Elias might fight. 2 years of watching a man rot on his own land, and Parnell figured the rot went all the way through. He figured wrong. The ride to Helena was 43 miles. Elias left before dawn the next morning, alone on horseback, February cold cutting through his coat like it wasn't there. The birthmark below his left ear went white with frost. His pale gray-blue eyes watered in the wind, and he didn't wipe them. He just rode. The clerk's office in Helena was a small room that smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. Elias gave the clerk the lien, the creditor's name, the date. The clerk disappeared into a back room for 20 minutes. Came back with a ledger and a single slip of paper. The debt was paid. Josephine had settled it herself. 7 weeks before she died. $312, paid in full, receipt signed in her own handwriting, that careful, slanting script Elias knew better than his own. She'd sold her mother's silver tea set, the one thing she'd brought from Pennsylvania, the one thing she never let him touch because it was hers, from before, from the life she'd had before she chose this one. She sold it and paid the debt, and never told him. She was protecting the ranch even at the end, even when she was too weak to walk to the barn, even when the specialist in Butte had already said there was nothing left to do. She was still fighting for this place. Elias sat in that clerk's office, holding that receipt, and understood something that broke him open in a way grief never had. Letting the ranch die wasn't honoring Josephine's memory. It was betraying it. She fought for this place with her last act, her last strength, her last possession. And he'd been surrendering what she saved, pouring whiskey on the grave of her sacrifice and calling it mourning. The grief didn't leave. It shifted, from loss to gratitude. And gratitude is harder to carry because gratitude demands something of you. Loss lets you sit down. Gratitude says, get up. He rode back in the dark, 43 miles. The stars were out and the cold was savage, and he didn't feel any of it. Clara was on the porch when he arrived. Brown leather belt cinched at her waist, gray wool shawl across her shoulders, dark auburn braid over one shoulder with loose strands escaping at the temples the way they always did. She had a lantern in one hand and worry in her wide-set brown eyes, and she didn't say a word. She just waited. "The ranch is clear," Elias said. "The debt was paid. Josephine paid it before she died." Clara closed her eyes, opened them, nodded. Then the harder thing. "I don't want to sell it to you," he said. She went still, that straight-backed, purposeful stillness. The 3 freckles on her left cheekbone caught the lantern light. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a tenant, not as a buyer. As the person who brought this place back to life and brought me back with it." Clara's hands gripped the porch rail. Her knuckles went white. "The last man I trusted rode away and didn't come back," she said. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. The crescent birthmark on the right side of her neck moved when she swallowed. "I can't do that again, Elias. I won't survive it again." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I've been here 20 years. The only place I ever tried to leave was my own life. and you wouldn't let me." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lantern hissed between them. Then the screen door creaked, and Bess leaned in the frame the way she always did. Light auburn hair tangled from wind, that half-smile resting on her wide mouth, the small leather-bound book in her cardigan pocket. "Does this mean we can keep the chickens?" The tension broke. Clara laughed, a real laugh, the first one Elias had heard from her that wasn't guarded, and the family formed in a single sentence. Parnell got his answer 3 days later. Elias rode to his office in town, laid the paid receipt on his desk, and watched those pale green, close-set eyes go flat with disbelief. "She paid it," Elias said. "My wife paid it, before she died. You built your whole play on a debt that doesn't exist." Parnell's thin wrists tightened on the desk edge. His pointed finger came up. "This isn't over, Cade." "Yeah," Elias said. "It is." He walked out. He didn't look back. Some men aren't worth a second glance, and Parnell was every one of them. Spring came the way it always does in Montana. Slowly, then all at once. The south pasture greened. The creek ran clear over smooth stones. The fences held. Every post Clara and Elias had driven, every wire they'd strung in the cold, every rail they'd replaced. It all held. The wedding was in April. The circuit preacher came through on a Tuesday. Hector stood as witness in his tan canvas jacket, the worn leather-handled hatchet still on his belt, because Hector was Hector. Dolores stood beside him in her dark green wool dress, dark brown eyes sharp and quick, hands folded over her cream apron, the small birthmark on her left wrist visible when she dabbed her eyes. Bess held wildflowers from the meadow above the house, columbine and lupine and Indian paintbrush, and she stood between them all with her hazel green eyes wide and her single dimple showing. No grand ceremony, just people standing in the place they chose. Clara wore the thin silver chain with her mother's wedding band. Elias wore the dull brass ring he'd never taken off. They said the words. He kissed her by the creek where the cottonwoods were just starting to leaf out. Her forehead rested against his chest, and his hand found the back of her braid. And they stood there while the water ran and the mountains watched. And nobody said a damn thing, because nothing needed saying. That was a long time ago now. I'm an old man. Silver hair, both of us. The porch at sunset is our church, and we attend every evening. Clara's hand in mine, still calloused, still strong, still the hand that rebuilt 50 acres from ruin while I was busy trying to disappear. Grandchildren on this land. Josephine's land. Clara's land. The land I almost gave away to a man in a frock coat who thought $400 could buy what 20 years of love had built. Hector's hatchet hangs on a nail in the barn now. Dolores still makes enough food for 4 at Sunday supper, even though the table seats 9. Bess teaches school in town. She married a young rancher who needed teaching, and she taught him, and their children run through the south pasture where the grass grows thick and the fences hold. I told Clara once, a long time ago, standing in a yard full of dead grass, that this ranch was too broken to save. She asked if she could try. What she saved was never the ranch at all.